He was given a barbarian as a wife, but she refused to be his wife until he overcomes her in battle. In the kingdom of Eldoria, a land where strength was prized above all else, a powerful tradition dictated that each prince or princess would be married to a warrior from the fiercest tribes. This was not a union of love, but one of necessity, a strategic alliance meant to secure the kingdom's future. And so, when Prince Darien, the youngest of Eldoria's royal family, was betrothed to the legendary barbarian warrior Arca, no one in the kingdom knew exactly what to expect. Prince Darien, though well-educated and skilled in diplomacy, had never been a warrior. His training had always been focused on matters of the mind, tactics, politics, and the intricacies of ruling. His physique was not one that would make the strongest of men cower, and his heart was often more filled with kindness than the bloodlust of battle. To the royal court, he was seen as a capable leader, but in comparison to Arca, the fearsome barbarian, Darien seemed weak. Arca, on the other hand, was a name that struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest soldiers. She had grown up in the harshest lands beyond the kingdom's borders, raised by a tribe that valued strength and survival above all else. She had led countless raids, battled fierce creatures, and carved her name into the history books. Known for her towering presence and unmatched combat skills, Arca was a woman who needed no one, and she certainly didn't need a prince by her side. As the wedding day approached, there was little excitement in the royal halls. Whispers filled the corridors, rumors spread among the people. Would Arca, a warrior hardened by years of battle, ever accept the delicate prince as her equal? Or would the marriage remain a mere formality, a political maneuver with no real heart behind it? The ceremony itself was magnificent. The kingdom's finest banners were hung, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the grand hall was packed with nobles, generals, and diplomats from all corners of the kingdom. Yet, despite the spectacle, the one thing missing was the joy that should have accompanied such an event. As Arca walked down the aisle, her steps heavy and defiant, she cast a glance at Darien that sent a chill down his spine. It was not a look of affection, but one of cold, calculating disinterest. When the vows were exchanged, Darien could feel the weight of Arca's indifference pressing down on him. She spoke her words without emotion, and when the priest declared them husband and wife, there was no warmth in her eyes. Her gaze drifted to the floor, her mind clearly elsewhere, as if the whole event was a mere inconvenience. To her, the bond between them was nothing more than a political strategy. To Darien, it was supposed to be a promise of partnership. Later that evening, in the privacy of their chambers, the tension between them became unbearable. Darien had hoped that, in time, they might find common ground, that Arca would come to see him not as a weak prince, but as someone worthy of her respect. But when he gently approached her, trying to speak of their future together, she only turned away, her arms crossed defensively. "I do not need a husband," Arca said coldly, her voice low and filled with disdain. "I need no one." Darien was taken aback by the harshness in her words. He had known she was strong, proud even, but he hadn't anticipated this level of rejection. His heart sank as he watched her, knowing there was little he could do to change her mind. "I'm not here to be just a title to you," Darien replied, his voice steady despite the hurt he felt. "I want to make this work. We're both strong in different ways. I believe we can be something more." But Arca's response was swift and final. She stood, walking away from him without a second glance, and murmured, "You are not my equal. You are a prince. I am a warrior. There is nothing more to this." The next day, as the royal court gathered for a banquet to celebrate the union, Darien felt the weight of the eyes upon him. The guests, though polite, were clearly awaiting any sign that Arca would accept him as her partner. Instead, she remained distant, her every movement a reminder of the divide between them. She spoke little, kept to herself, and when Darien tried to approach her, she dismissed him with a curt nod. In the weeks that followed, things did not improve. Arca's refusal to acknowledge their marriage as anything more than a political arrangement ate at Darien's pride. He had spent years preparing for this moment, to be not just a ruler, but a partner in a new era of unity for Eldoria. But it seemed that the woman he had been bound to had no intention of playing her part. She had no interest in building a life with him, nor did she have any intention of respecting him as her equal. One day, in a moment of frustration, Darien made a decision. He couldn't accept this, he wouldn't. Arca might be a fierce warrior, but he had his own strengths, and it was time he proved them. He stood before her, his resolve hardening. "Arca," he began, his voice firm, "if you will not accept me as your husband, then perhaps I must prove to you that I am worthy of that title." She raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. "You wish to challenge me?" Darian nodded. "Yes, not for my title, but for your respect. I will fight you not with the strength of a warrior, but with the mind of a prince. If I win, you will acknowledge me as your equal." Arca's lips curled into a mocking smile. "You think you can best me in combat, little prince? I don't need to best you in strength." "But I will prove that there is more to power than muscle," Darian replied, his words steady and unwavering. For a moment, Arca stood silent, studying him with a look that was unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she nodded slowly, a spark of intrigue in her eyes. "Very well, Prince," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "We will see if your mind is enough to match my strength." The challenge was set. A battle was coming, one that would test not only their physical abilities, but their very notions of power and strength. And with it, a glimmer of hope ignited in Darian's heart. If he could prove his worth in this battle, perhaps he could change not only Arca's view of him, but the future of their kingdom. As the day of the battle approached, Darian prepared in his own way. He didn't have Arca's strength, but he had something else. A mind sharp as steel, honed through years of study and strategy. He would use the arena of battle to show her that power came in many forms, and it wasn't always about who could throw the hardest punch. The day of the duel arrived. The entire court gathered in the royal arena, and the tension was palpable. The people of Eldoria knew this would be no ordinary fight. It would be a test of more than just physical prowess. It would determine the future of the kingdom itself. The battle began with a deafening cheer from the gathered crowd, their eyes locked on the two figures standing at opposite ends of the arena. On one side, Prince Darian stood, his stance calm but resolute. On the other side, Arca, the fearsome barbarian, towered over him, her muscles rippling beneath the wild furs she wore, a smirk playing across her lips. The arena was alive with excitement, but for Darian, it felt like a moment frozen in time. This fight was more than just a contest of strength. It was a battle for his pride, his future, and the respect he desperately sought from the woman he had been forced to call his wife. As the trumpet sounded, the fight began. Arca charged first, as expected. She was a whirlwind of motion, her massive sword swinging with terrifying force. Darian barely had time to react, leaping back just as her weapon sliced through the air where he had stood a moment before. He felt the rush of wind as the blade missed him by inches, and his heart pounded with the knowledge that if he miscalculated, he would not survive the next blow. But Darian was no fool. While Arca's strength and speed were unmatched, he had something she did not, the ability to think several steps ahead. He had studied battle tactics his entire life, understanding how the greatest warriors were often undone by their own overconfidence. Arca, with all her power, was not invincible. She was a warrior of instinct, driven by raw emotion and the thrill of battle. Darian, on the other hand, was driven by a different kind of precision. He dodged another wild swing from Arca and with a calculated movement darted to her side. He knew he couldn't match her in raw strength, but he could outmaneuver her. With a swift movement, he jabbed at her side, aiming for a weak spot in her armor. The blow landed, though it was not enough to cause significant harm. Arca hissed in pain and turned, her eyes narrowing with a fierce glow. "You're faster than I gave you credit for, Prince," Arca spat, her voice low with a mixture of irritation and respect. Darian didn't reply. He was focused, his mind working overtime to keep track of every move she made. He knew that this was just the beginning. Arca's strength was overwhelming, but it was her pride that might be her downfall. She was used to dominating every fight, never having to worry about someone outsmarting her. Darian, however, was playing a different game, one that required patience, calculation, and the willingness to take risks. Arca lunged again, her blade flashing through the air like a lightning strike. This time, Darian wasn't quick enough to dodge, and the blade grazed his shoulder. He winced as pain shot through his arm, but he quickly regained his footing. Blood dripped down his arm, but his resolve hardened. He would not let this be the end. He had come too far. He could see the satisfaction in Arca's eyes as she saw his blood spill. She was enjoying this, enjoying the thrill of finally landing a blow. But Darian was not the kind of man to back down from a challenge, no matter how painful it was. With renewed determination, he tightened his grip on his sword. His mind flashed back to his training, to the countless hours he had spent studying war strategy, learning how to use his mind to overcome opponents far stronger than himself. He had always believed that intellect was the true weapon, and this fight was his chance to prove it. Arca swung again, this time with even more force, expecting Darien to be off balance after the wound. But Darien was ready. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward, using his small frame to slip underneath her wild strike. In the same motion, he drove his blade toward her unprotected side. The strike was swift and precise, landing deep into the gap between her ribs and the armor that covered her torso. For a moment, there was silence. Arca stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she felt the sharp sting of the wound. She staggered back, her grip loosening on her sword. Darien stood tall, sweat dripping from his brow, but there was no smugness in his eyes. He hadn't won yet. The crowd gasped, and for the first time, Darien saw a flicker of doubt in Arca's eyes. She was not invincible. She was not untouchable. And for the first time in their brief relationship, she was looking at him not as a weak prince, but as a worthy opponent. But Arca was a warrior, and warriors did not show weakness. She recovered quickly, her pride burning brighter than the pain from her wound. With a snarl, she threw herself back into the fight, her movements now even more unpredictable. Her anger fueled her strength, and the air seemed to crackle with her energy. Darien knew this was the most dangerous moment. Anger made Arca more volatile, and in her fury, she could make rash decisions. He needed to stay focused to keep outmaneuvering her, but he was starting to tire. The wound on his arm was slowing him down, and he knew he couldn't keep up this pace for much longer. He needed to end it, and quickly. As Arca swung her sword again, Darien ducked and rolled to the side. He used the momentum of his roll to spring to his feet and dashed toward the edge of the arena. His plan was risky, but it was his best shot. He needed to get behind her where she wouldn't expect him. Arca followed, her heavy steps echoing in the arena. She was quick, but Darien had the advantage of surprise. As she reached the spot where he had been moments before, he sprang up from behind her, his sword aimed straight at the back of her knee. It was a calculated move, one that would cripple her ability to move freely, giving him a chance to win the fight. The blade met its mark, and Arca cried out, stumbling forward. She fell to one knee, her sword clattering to the ground beside her. Darien stood over her, breathing heavily, his body aching from the strain of the fight. He had done it. He had beaten her not with strength, but with strategy and resolve. For a moment, there was only silence. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure of what would happen next. Arca's pride had been shattered, but Darien wasn't sure if she would accept defeat. She was a barbarian, a woman who had never known surrender. Darien extended a hand to her, offering her the chance to end the fight with honor, but Arca refused to take it. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fury and something else, something Darien couldn't quite place. "You think you've won?" she spat, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I think I've proven that there's more to power than strength," Darien replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Arca glared at him, but there was something different in her gaze now. It wasn't just hatred, it was respect. Slowly, she stood up, using the last of her strength to regain her composure. Her pride was still intact, but something had shifted between them. "You may have won this round, Prince," she said, her voice quieter now, almost begrudgingly. "But this is far from over." Darien nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I didn't expect it to be." And with that, the fight came to an end. The crowd erupted into applause, but Darien barely heard it. His mind was still focused on the woman in front of him. The woman who had, for the first time, seen him as more than just a prince. There was a long road ahead, but this battle had been just the beginning. As Arca turned and walked away, Darien knew that this was far from the end of their story. There would be more challenges, more battles, and perhaps even more moments like this one, where respect and understanding could finally bridge the gap between them. But for now, he had won something far more important than a battle. He had won a place in her world. And that, in itself, was a victory. The days that followed the battle were quiet, but the air between Darien and Arca was thick with unspoken tension. Although she had acknowledged his victory in their duel, there was still something unresolved, something that neither of them could ignore. Arca was still a warrior bound by her own code of pride, and Darien, despite his success in battle, could not shake the feeling that his true test had yet to come. Darien had expected that after the fight, things would change between them. But even as they shared the same space, even as they ate together at the royal table, there was a distance between them. Arca, though she no longer showed open contempt, kept to herself. She was still the warrior who had once claimed that she needed no one. She had not yet accepted him as an equal, and Darian couldn't help but feel the weight of her coldness. He tried to engage her, to speak to her about their future, but Arca remained silent, her eyes distant, as if her mind were elsewhere. She no longer refused his presence, but she did not invite his company either. Darian began to wonder if there would ever be a moment when they could move beyond the battle, beyond the awkward tension that hung like a shadow over them. One morning, as Darian walked through the royal gardens, he noticed Arca standing at the edge of a small pond, her reflection rippling in the water. She was looking at the reflection of the sky, her posture tense yet calm. She seemed lost in thought, and for a moment Darian hesitated to approach her, but something inside him urged him to try again. Slowly, he walked toward her, careful not to startle her. When he was close enough, he cleared his throat gently, and Arca turned her head to look at him. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a quiet recognition. "I didn't expect you to be here," Darian said, trying to keep his tone casual. "I go where I please," Arca replied, her voice devoid of warmth but not unkind. "This garden is no exception." Darian took a deep breath, his mind racing for the right words. "Arca, I wanted to talk about what happens next." She raised an eyebrow. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice holding a hint of challenge. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the subject. "You've changed since the battle. I thought things might be different between us, but I don't know where to go from here." Arca's gaze turned back to the water, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I never asked for your respect, Darian. You earned it, yes, but it doesn't change who I am, and it doesn't change what I want." Darian was taken aback by her words. For a moment he was silent, unsure of how to respond. Arca had always been blunt, but this was something different. It wasn't just pride. It was a reminder that she was still Arca, the barbarian warrior who had been forged in the fire of battle. She wasn't someone who could be easily molded or shaped by the expectations of others. "I know that," Darian said quietly. "But we're bound together now, Arca. Whether we like it or not, we have a duty to each other, to this kingdom, and I want to find a way to make that work." Arca remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. "You think I care about duty?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think I care about what the kingdom wants? I've fought for my freedom all my life. I don't answer to anyone." "I'm not asking you to answer to me," Darian replied, his voice firm. "But I'm asking you to consider that there might be something more than just your fight. There's something here between us. We can build something stronger, not because we're forced to, but because we choose to." Arca turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. For a moment there was only silence between them, the sounds of the garden filling the space. Then slowly she spoke. "You're a prince," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "You've never had to fight for anything the way I have. You've never had to earn your place through blood and sweat, through pain and survival. You think you can change who I am with words and promises. You think I need you?" Darian stood still, feeling the weight of her words. He had known that she would be difficult to reach, that she was a woman shaped by experiences he could never understand. But this was the moment when he would either give up or push through. And he chose to push through. "No," he said, his voice unwavering. "I don't think you need me, but I think we need each other in ways we can't even understand yet. I don't want to change you, Arca. I want to stand beside you as partners, equals." Arca's eyes searched his face for a moment, as if looking for something she had not yet found. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she turned away from him and began to walk toward the castle, her steps purposeful. Darian followed, a mixture of hope and uncertainty stirring in his chest. For the first time since their battle, there was a subtle shift in their relationship. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Darian a sense of direction. He knew that he could not change Arca overnight, nor could he force her to see him as an equal, but he had planted a seed, and sometimes that was all it took. Over the next few weeks, Darian continued to try. He spent time with Arca, not just in the formal settings of the royal halls, but in the quiet moments, walking together in the gardens, sharing meals, and even sparring with her. He knew that she was testing him, seeing if he was truly committed to the path he had set for them. And with each passing day, he could feel the barrier between them weakening just a little. There were moments when Arca would look at him with something other than disdain, a flicker of curiosity, of respect, even of something more. And though it was fleeting, it was enough for Darian to hold on to. He knew that their journey was far from over, and there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time, he felt like they might be able to face those challenges together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and red, Darian stood with Arca on the castle's balcony. They were silent for a long time, watching the world unfold before them. It was a rare moment of peace, and for the first time since their marriage, Darian felt like they were truly sharing something. "Do you ever wonder, Arca," he asked quietly, "what it would be like if we weren't bound by duty, by tradition?" Arca looked at him, her gaze thoughtful. "I used to wonder, but I've learned that the world doesn't give us such luxuries. We fight for what we can, and we make the best of what we have." Darian nodded, understanding the truth in her words. But there was something in her voice, a softness that hadn't been there before. And he knew that, despite everything, they were starting to build something that wasn't just about survival, but about partnership. For the first time, he felt like there was a future for them. Not just a future of obligation, but one where they could find their place together. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs, and that was enough for now. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them, Darian and Arca stood side by side, not as prince and barbarian, but as two people who had faced each other in battle, and who were now learning to face the world together. The weeks that followed brought a subtle, undeniable shift in the dynamic between Darian and Arca. Though their marriage had begun as nothing more than a political arrangement, they were slowly starting to carve out a new path. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were still moments of tension, but both had begun to understand each other in ways they hadn't before. Darian, the young prince, was no longer the naive ruler who thought he could win Arca's heart through words alone. And Arca, the fierce barbarian warrior, had started to see the value in what Darian had to offer beyond his royal bloodline. Despite the growing respect between them, there was still an undeniable distance. Arca had never been one to let down her guard easily, and Darian knew that earning her full trust and affection would take time. Yet he couldn't help but feel that they were on the brink of something important. The real test, however, came when their bond was pushed to the limit. One fateful morning, a messenger arrived at the castle, bearing urgent news. The kingdom had received word of a rogue tribe that had been terrorizing the borders of Eldoria. This tribe, known for their brutality, had been raiding villages, stealing resources, and leaving destruction in their wake. The situation had grown dire, and it was only a matter of time before the tribe would set its sights on the royal capital itself. Darian had been preparing to meet with the council when the messenger arrived. His first instinct was to rely on the strength of the royal army, but as the news sank in, he realized that this was not a simple matter of sending troops. The rogue tribe had a reputation for their ferocity, and their leader, a ruthless warlord named Kor, was known for his tactical genius. This would be a battle unlike any the kingdom had faced before. As the council gathered in the war room, Darian found himself listening intently to the advice of his advisors. But despite their plans, his mind kept drifting to Arca. She had proven herself to be an invaluable ally in their earlier struggles, and her knowledge of battle tactics was unmatched. If there was anyone who could help them turn the tide, it was her. With a deep breath, Darian turned to face her. Arca had been standing by the window, her arms crossed, watching the council with her usual cool detachment. She had always been an outsider in the royal court, but Darian could see that she was beginning to take an interest in what was happening around them. She was no longer the unwilling wife. She had become an integral part of the kingdom's strategy. "Arca," Darian said, his voice steady but filled with purpose, "I need your help. We're facing an enemy unlike any we've encountered. This tribe is savage and they are well organized. We need to strike before they reach the capital. What do you suggest?" Arca's gaze shifted from the window to Darian, her expression unreadable. For a moment there was silence, and then she nodded slowly. "I've seen Kor's tactics before," she said, her voice calm and measured. "He's a warlord who thrives on chaos. He'll want to draw us out, make us fight on his terms, but that's a mistake. If we can control the battle, we can force him into a position where he has no choice but to engage on our terms." Darian listened intently, grateful for her insight. She had a way of seeing the battlefield that few others could. But even as he listened to her advice, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. Arca was no longer just a warrior fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for the kingdom as well. And Darian knew that this battle, this war, would require them to rely on each other more than ever before. With a new sense of urgency, the two of them set out to implement a plan. Arca led the charge in rallying the kingdom's warriors, training them in the tactics they would need to face the rogue tribe. Darian, meanwhile, worked tirelessly with the council, ensuring that resources were allocated and defenses were put in place. It was a race against time, and there was no room for error. As the days passed, the tension in the kingdom mounted. The air seemed thick with anticipation, and every day brought new reports of the tribe's movements. The scouts reported that Kor was growing bolder, raiding villages closer and closer to the capital. His forces were strong, but Darian's army was ready. The question was whether they would be able to stop him before he could reach the heart of Eldoria. The day of the battle arrived, and the kingdom stood ready. The warriors, led by Arca, gathered at the front lines, their faces set in grim determination. Darian, though filled with nerves, stood beside them, feeling the weight of the kingdom's future on his shoulders. He had learned much from Arca over the past few weeks, and now more than ever, he realized that this battle was not just about physical strength. It was about strategy, about knowing when to strike and when to wait. As the battle began, Arca's leadership became immediately apparent. She moved through the battlefield with ease, directing the troops with precision, her eyes constantly scanning the area for weaknesses in the enemy's formation. She was in her element, a warrior born for this chaos. Darian, though not a soldier, was able to hold his own, using the knowledge he had gained from his studies to guide his men with confidence. Together, they led the charge against Kor's forces, pushing them back inch by inch. Despite their combined efforts, the battle was far from over. Kor's tribe was relentless, and their tactics were cunning. Every time Darian and Arca thought they had gained the upper hand, the enemy would shift, adapting to their movements and pushing forward once again. It became clear that this was not a fight that could be won through brute force alone. They needed to outsmart Kor. As the sun began to set, Darian and Arca found themselves at the heart of the battlefield, facing off against Kor himself. The warlord was a towering figure, his armor battered from the day's fighting, but his eyes burned with fury. He knew that this battle was his last chance to secure his dominance over Eldoria. His forces had dwindled, but he was still a formidable foe. The two leaders locked eyes, each sizing the other up. Darian felt a surge of determination rise within him. This was his chance to prove once and for all that he was not just a prince, but a ruler capable of leading his people to victory. Arca stood beside him, her sword at the ready, her gaze unwavering. Together they would face Kor and his forces. The clash was brutal. Kor's sword came down with crushing force, but Darian was quick, parrying the blow and retaliating with a strike aimed at the warlord's side. Arca moved like lightning, darting in to strike at Kor's vulnerable points, her movements precise and deadly. But Kor was no novice. He fought with the strength of a man who had seen countless battles, and his attacks were swift and unforgiving. For a moment, Darian felt the weight of the battle closing in on him. Kor's blows were becoming harder to block, and his energy was beginning to fade. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder, a reassuring grip that steadied him. It was Arca. She had come to his side, and together they were stronger than they had been alone. With a final, decisive strike, Darian and Arca brought Kor to his knees. The warlord fell, his sword clattering to the ground as he stared up at the two of them. It was over. The battle was won. As the remaining forces of Kor's tribe surrendered, Darian and Arca stood side by side, looking out over the battlefield. The kingdom had been saved, and they had proven themselves not just as rulers, but as equals. The victory was not just about defeating an enemy, it was about the bond that had formed between Darian and Arca. They had fought together, learned from each other, and emerged stronger than ever. And as they stood there, with the kingdom's future secured, Darian knew that this was only the beginning of their journey. There would be more challenges ahead, but with Arca by his side, he was ready to face them. The days after the battle were filled with both celebration and reflection. Eldoria had been saved, the rogue tribe was defeated, and the capital was safe once more. Yet for Darian and Arca, the true victory was not the triumph on the battlefield, but the bond that had grown between them through the shared struggle. The warlord Kor had fallen, but in a way, it was their personal journey that had seen the greatest change. What had begun as a forced union between a prince and a barbarian warrior had evolved into something deeper, something real. Darian couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. When he first met Arca, she had been nothing more than a wild force of nature, a woman who had no interest in being tied down, especially not to a prince like him. She had rejected him, his offer of partnership, and even the idea that they could work together. But now, as he stood beside her, looking at the kingdom they had saved, he realized how much he had underestimated both her and himself. As the royal court celebrated their victory, Darian and Arca remained distant from the revelry, retreating to a quiet corner of the castle. The crowds cheered, the nobles toasted to their success, but Darian found that he didn't need the applause. He didn't need the accolades. What mattered was the quiet understanding that had begun to form between him and Arca. "Do you think they'll ever accept us?" Darian asked, his voice soft as he stood next to Arca, watching the celebrations from a balcony. He knew she wasn't one for the pomp and circumstance that accompanied such events, but he couldn't help but wonder. The people of Eldoria had witnessed their struggle, their fight against a common enemy, but would they ever truly see them as more than just a political union? Arca's eyes were focused on the crowd below, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Darian wondered if she had heard him at all. But then she spoke, her voice calm and steady. "It doesn't matter," she said. "What matters is that we know who we are. The rest will follow." Darian turned to look at her, surprised by the depth of her words. Arca had always been a woman of action, of force. She rarely spoke in such a reflective manner, and it struck him how much she had changed since their first meeting. There was a quiet wisdom in her now, something he hadn't seen before. "You're right," he said, nodding slowly. "I suppose I've been so focused on what others think of us that I forgot what really matters. We've proven ourselves, Arca, to each other, to the kingdom." Arca finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. For a moment there was a flicker of something in her gaze, not the cold, distant warrior who had first met him, but something softer, something warmer. "We have," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the real challenge begins now." Darian raised an eyebrow, sensing the weight in her words. "What do you mean?" Arca's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "The battle is never truly over. The kingdom will need more than just victories. It will need unity. It will need leadership. And that, Darian, is where you come in." Darian felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. He had been a prince his whole life, groomed to lead, but he had never truly understood what leadership meant until now. It wasn't about ruling from a throne or winning battles. It was about guiding the kingdom with wisdom, compassion, and strength that came not just from the sword, but from the heart. "Together," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll lead them." Arca didn't respond immediately, but her gaze softened. "Together," she repeated, as if tasting the word. Then she looked out over the kingdom, her expression distant again, but this time there was something different in the way she held herself. She was no longer a warrior alone. She was a part of something greater, and so was he. The days that followed were filled with the work of rebuilding and solidifying their leadership. The people of Eldoria, once divided over the union between Darian and Arca, began to see the strength of their partnership. Slowly, they came to understand that Darian's intellect and Arca's raw power were not opposing forces, but complementary ones. Together, they formed a leadership that could face the challenges ahead, not as prince and barbarian, but as partners in every sense of the word. Arca took her place by Darian's side, not as a wife in the traditional sense, but as a trusted advisor and warrior. She trained the royal guards, sharing her combat expertise, and helped shape the kingdom's defenses. Her wisdom and experience were invaluable, and Darian could see that, despite her reluctance to show emotion, she cared deeply for the kingdom they were both now sworn to protect. Darian, for his part, worked tirelessly to govern with fairness and vision. He knew that there would always be those who questioned his abilities, who doubted his right to rule, but he was no longer concerned with their opinions. He had the trust of the people who mattered most, the people of Eldoria, and the woman who stood beside him. One evening, as Darian sat at his desk, going over reports from the various regions of the kingdom, Arca entered the room, her footsteps light but steady. He looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers, and for a moment the weight of the day seemed to lift. "We've done well," Arca said, her voice softer than usual, "but there's still much to be done." Darian smiled, closing the papers in front of him. "I know. But I believe we're on the right path. Arca nodded, but there was a thoughtful look in her eyes. You've come a long way, Darian. I never thought I'd see the day when you'd be the one to bring people together. I never thought I'd see the day when you'd be standing by my side, he replied with a grin. Her lips twitched almost as if she might smile. But then she turned serious again. We've both changed, but there's one thing I still don't understand. Darian raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's that? Arca stepped closer, her gaze intense. You've seen what I am, what I've done. Why would you want me beside you in a kingdom like this, where there's still so much to prove? Darian's heart swelled with a feeling he had not expected. He stood up slowly, walking toward her. Because I see the strength in you, Arca, not just the strength of a warrior, but the strength of a woman who's fought for her place in the world. That's the kind of strength this kingdom needs. For the first time, Arca allowed a genuine smile to reach her lips. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She had come to realize that her place in Eldoria was not defined by her past, but by the choices she made now. And Darian, for all his nobility and intellect, had come to understand that leadership wasn't just about power. It was about trust, partnership, and respect. Then we will lead them, Arca said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Darian nodded, knowing that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, not just against enemies from outside the kingdom, but against the doubts and fears that still lingered within. But as long as they stood together, Darian knew they would face whatever came with strength, wisdom, and unity. And so, as the sun set over the kingdom of Eldoria, Darian and Arca stood side by side, ready to face the future, not as prince and barbarian, but as partners in every sense of the word. Together they would shape the kingdom, lead it into an era of prosperity and peace, and prove that strength, true strength, was found in the bonds that held them together.